I was not a model student throughout high school and college. Studying, memorization, knowledge, chump stuff. I got my work done on the first pass, let it sit for days or weeks before the due date, and just coasted into the deadline. While I basked in my proactivity, my heart and passion were with those bright lights projected on my TV screen. I had time to burn, and nowhere was that more apparent than in my journey with Rogue Legacy. I have faint memories of hours sitting in my apartment dorm, slamming my nose into the grindstone over and over and over again to push just a little further into that daunting castle, scraping together just enough gold to buy the next upgrade, to push an inch deeper into the castle, standing my ground against a boss for a moment longer. It was all part of the game, part of the experience. For days, weeks, months of on and off gaming, the grind was part of the experience. Fast forward. I am older, more decrepit than I was, employed in various positions that actually make you, be physically present and disconnected. But despite all of my life changes, center of the universe that I am, they went and released Rogue Legacy 2 anyway. And for a time, it was like putting on an old pair of shoes. Familiar and comfortable. The gameplay was fun and quirky, and I knew it. I remembered it. It was comforting, but then it felt slogging, frustrating. I kept hitting walls that felt like they took too long to climb over, encountered obstacles that didn't so much challenge me as they did irritate me. Couldn't collect enough gold for long enough to afford that next branch in the skill tree. The grind was still part of the experience, but I had changed. What I was looking for had changed. Where once I reveled in pulling myself through a field of fire and glass for an ounce more power, one more step into the castle's depths, now I just wanted to relax, enjoy myself, collect some loot, beat up some cartoony bad guys, and feel like I was making progress. And really, is that so wrong? Before we get further into this, let's look back for a moment to the progenitors of these games, all the way back to the first home consoles. Consider the Nintendo Entertainment System's library as a prime reference. Due to smaller staffs, those first home games were designed, out of necessity, with replayability in mind, compounded by a game's dual helix model of short length and brutal difficulty. Before memory packs and save states became a common design element, you didn't need to save. If you played your cards right, you could beat a game in a couple hours, assuming it didn't beat you first. But the difficulty spike started high and, more often than not, still found a way to spike even higher. To beat these first games called for mastery, for revisitation, for an exhaustive understanding of the game itself. In the past, video games were a luxury item, and players often had only a handful of cartridges to choose from in their home library. As a designer, you had to make the player's experience last, even if it meant them replaying the same section over and over again to, someday, witness the end credits in triumph. The more time passed, the more games evolved in design, hardware, and staffing. Save states and passwords became commonplace. Difficulty options started popping up when you create a new file. More designers and programmers working on a game meant that there could be more in the game to play. The more time passed, the larger these games became. The longer it took to beat them, the more they could ease up on the difficulty. The time players spent playing a larger game on normal could match or exceed the amount of time they would spend building up mastery of a much shorter game. Difficulty became more of a progressive ramp rather than a hard uptick. Back to the present. Love it or hate it, regardless of quality, we exist in a period of narrative and experiential plenty. Books and written stories, TV series and movies, 100 different streaming services, and games exploding out from AAA juggernauts and independent developers the world over. No one can feasibly experience all of it in their lifespan. But with so many games I want to play, interactive experiences to have, I want to actually experience them. I don't want to be hung up on a grind-based difficulty for longer than I have to be. Sometimes you just want to have the chance to be a bit more reckless, or to be a little tougher in the face of adversity, or actually have a chance to amass enough in-game gold to afford a single upgrade point. I don't have time to burn anymore. Instead, I want the experiences I seek to respect my time, and I don't think that's so wrong. More and more, it feels like games are designed to waste time, to give incremental, sluggish progress in exchange for a great deal of our time. using a revolving door of ever-changing rules every run, unable to give a singular concrete experience and forcing players into gameplay they don't enjoy but have to muddle through, as though the game is less a game and more homework. Or just leaning too hard into old-school get good or stop playing mentalities circa the NES. More than enjoyment, these games just seem to generate frustration and ire. Spelunky has intimidated me for years and will continue to do so. The steep difficulty, the permanent defeat, even against its adorable art style, it's a cycle I'm hesitant to start. Slay the Spire is designed with a certain sense of randomness, dictated by a character's cards drawn every turn of combat, even when players dictate the deck itself. You can't depend on a consistent toolkit like in a standard RPG. The Binding of Isaac is entirely randomized, from the labyrinth's geography to the enemies and bosses encountered to the power-ups littered throughout. Darkest Dungeon revels in ripping your characters apart after having spent hours building them up to withstand the worst of the Cursed Mansion, forcing you to drop back to the lower rung of the ladder. Loop Hero is entirely dependent on its loop mechanic, not just making the combat and main encounters a passive element, but even on faster speeds, forcing players to wade through a monotonous loop, landscape changes be damned. Upon defeat, the spoils of victory are hardly enough to make a difference from run to run. Prey Mooncrash depends on players understanding every facet of the Pythias moon base through tens of different runs, all in order to make one perfect run to trigger a win state. But cycle back to Rogue Legacy, way back when. The multitudes of deaths, the ever-shifting halls and corridors, the random enemy placement, the steep difficulty curve, all the things that steer me away from games now are what I loved about Rogue Legacy. It was the vibe, the nostalgia for the experience, not the specific mechanics that guided my hand that paid for Rogue Legacy 2. With the original Rogue Legacy, I was a college student doing tutoring work or making a pittance as a resident assistant. I didn't have money to burn, but I had time to burn. That one game, that one loop was worth the investment at the time. Building up my suite of permanent enhancements felt like I was making progress in the long term. Permanent enhancements have long made roots in roguelike games. Rogue Legacy's Castle, Prey Mooncrash's Neuromod upgrades, and Hades' Mirror of Night all provide that very sense of progression. Standing opposite that are games like Spelunky, Slay the Spire, and The Binding of Isaac, which call for awareness and understanding in order to push through to the credits. But where some of those permanent enhancements may tilt the scales in the long term, getting the currency to acquire those enhancements can feel like a slog in the short term. Again, if you have time to burn like I did between work and classes, you're golden. But if you don't, if you need a greater sense of progress to feel validated by an experience, then the progress you get can feel like a minuscule trickle. You're left grinding away at one section just to get strong enough to progress to the next, or beat the boss at the end, or drag yourself past whatever the barrier is. And the longer the game, the longer and steeper the ramp of difficulty climbs. Each of the 7 sections in Rogue Legacy 2 denoted an increased risk, demonstrated by the power and strength of the enemies within. For each section, that meant incrementally more difficult encounters, requiring incrementally stronger upgrades, and incrementally more time chipping away at both. It's the difference between games that feel like they take forever to gain an inch and games that challenge you in a specific format. The newer Donkey Kong Country titles, the Super Mario Bros. Entries, or Celeste all challenge players with a certain element of all the tools already presented to them: jumping, dashing, rolling, climbing, whatever they are. The game is challenging players on the format, on one set racetrack. In this level, the enemy will always be here, this pit here, this secret here. Other games will shuffle the hurdles around with every starting shot, forcing you to improvise with every race. You can expect to see this enemy, but not in the same place as before. Also, these rooms are laid out differently. You can still expect the same boss, but somewhere different than you found them the last time. With enough time and practice, sure, you could get really good at reading the hurdles and adjusting your run on the fly, but not everyone has time to train for that. But then we also come to designers' visions. Think of Dark Souls and the From Software library. While singular in their maps and layouts, they are known for being brutally difficult in their own way, calling for that sense of understanding and mastery I mentioned earlier, and created that way intentionally. Audience subsets have clamored for easier modes or difficulty settings, and From Software has never relented. Either you seek the experience we have created, or you don't. On the flip side, the Super Mario Bros. Games have had super guides in their titles since the Wii generation, as did Donkey Kong Country Returns. If you get defeated on a stage so many times, the helpful question block or checkpoint pig will ask if you want to activate the super guide, completing the level on autopilot or in full invincibility so you can just move on. You won't keep any collectibles, but you'll be able to proceed and see the next stage. These games are designed for gamers of all stripes and skills, kids to adults, newbies to experts, in a time when this may not be the only game in their library. Designers' visions play into those kinds of decisions and whether they can attract or repel various would-be players. How much should an experience cater to me through difficulty adjustments, etc., if I am not its target audience? Conversely, is it more beneficial to cast a wide net to attract that wide spectrum of different gamers, either from a design or business perspective? Consider the trajectory of game difficulty again. With that more manageable difficulty, that surmountable challenge, there came more and more games to play. Availability of the new morphed with the challenge of the old, creating games like Rogue Legacy, while seemingly still on an upward trajectory with both content and playtime. The games were larger and took longer to beat than the progenitors in the NES, but were just as difficult in their own way. If a book doesn't grip you, you put it down. If a movie or a show doesn't pull you in, you turn it off. And if I feel like I'm not making any progress in a game, I quit it. Games are unique in the world of media because they're the only ones where progress can be dependent on the one experiencing the media. When it comes to games, whether massive or narrow in scope, I just want to feel like I'm making progress. There's only so many times I can play the same area, procedurally generated or not, before it starts to wear me down in service to the grind. Before long, that escape key starts to look more and more friendly by comparison. The experience doesn't have to be weighted entirely one side or the other, only catering exclusively to the audience wants or the creator's visions. It's not hard to find the balance. Many games already have. Just as there are various visual and audio settings to cater to a player's setup or wants in an experience, more and more games are presenting knobs and dials for players to adjust for their sense of momentum and progression, rather than challenge and grind. But most importantly, they are optional. Celeste is a top-tier example of this balance in action. Players control Madeline through the challenge room-based platformer, requiring them to clear individual challenges using Madeline's set toolkit. Moving and jumping, a limited stamina well for climbing, and a mid-air dash. Little quirks in various levels adjust these mechanics on a case-by-case basis. Special fruit permitting an additional dash, for example, or a starry mass that propels a dashing Madeline forward in a straight line. It is a challenging game, and it involved a lot of sighing, gripping the controller, and held breath as I clawed my way through the base game, and it was worth it for me. For others, there are assist mode options. The standard limited well of stamina could become unlimited. You could air dash twice without landing, or an infinite number of times. You could enter the equivalent of platformer bullet time, choosing with ease and comfort the direction you wanted to launch. Or you could just make yourself entirely invincible. Players could beat the game with the base toolkit, overcome its challenges, experience Celeste as it was designed. But Celeste isn't just a challenging platformer. It's telling a story of Madeline, determined to reach the summit of Celeste Mountain to overcome and accept certain parts of herself. Sometimes players are more invested in the story, the narrative triumph, than they are in earning the triumph mechanically. And it isn't an all-or-nothing switch where you go through the game either as designed or assisted. Players can choose how much assistance they want moment to moment. Just need an extra moment to direct your dash? A few more seconds to hold onto the ledge and catch your breath like a self-made checkpoint? You adjust the dials where you need them, where they'll make the experience mean the most to you. Often, what means a great deal to gamers, to anyone experiencing a piece of media, is that sense of momentum and progress I mentioned earlier. New Super Mario Bros. Wii, New Super Mario Bros. U, and Donkey Kong Country Returns also permit players to call upon a super guide to help complete a level they're struggling in. All of them permit players to jump in and try to finish the stage themselves at any time. Level completion via super guide allows players to continue to the next stage, but will not retain any special collectibles found. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, as of the Nintendo Switch release, has Funky Mode, which beefs up Donkey Kong from the outset and allows players to control Funky Kong, who can use his invulnerable surfboard and powerful jumping abilities to trivialize some of the harder level elements. The caveat for Funky Mode is that it can only be selected when you start a new game, not at any point throughout play. That said, in New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, players could choose to control the likes of Nabbit or Toadette anytime from the map screen. Doing so provides additional time on the countdown clock, easier underwater controlling, easier gaining of extra lives, and, as Toadette, platforming perks, or, as Nabbit, traditional invulnerability. From the map screen again, Super Mario Bros. Wonder allows players to control either different colored Yoshis, who have flutter jumps and invulnerability to enemies, although they do flinch and are knocked back if they run into one, or Nabbit once more, who retains their traditional invulnerability without flinching. Players can control the traditional Mario & Co. for as long as they want, but if they need a boost to complete a level, or are playing with a less experienced family member or friend, these alternate options help to bridge the gap and engage a wide variety of players and needs in gameplay. Mastery is no longer Mario and Donkey Kong's pursuit. They have changed, their audience has changed, their goals have changed. Mastery can come later. Right now, wouldn't you rather see everything the game has to offer? But what if a game isn't based on levels, progression, or plot? Instead, it's a pure challenge, you against an increasingly more difficult game system. Balatro's appeal, aside from making numbers go super big, is in the pure challenge of understanding and gaming the system run to run. No frills, no story, no sense of progress lost. You're not locked out of an experience or a narrative because you don't have the skills to witness it. Balatro is a system designed with a razor's edge, with payoff not coming from making an ever stronger character, reaching the end, or learning the lore, but in understanding and pushing a run's mechanics as far past the limit as you can. It is a pure gameplay experience. The balance in Balatro comes from removing an entire arm of the scale. The cyclical gameplay is perfectly balanced because there is no counterweight against it. Let's talk accessibility. Games are jumping onto this more and more, making themselves enjoyable to all sorts of people with varying degrees of vision and hearing ability. High contrast modes, various subtitle options, the works. But they've also been doing more with difficulty. Juggernauts like God of War Ragnarök have a 5-point difficulty slider that players can adjust at any time throughout their adventure. I played through and was satisfied with the challenge of the middle difficulty, but absolutely dumped it to the easiest level so I could get one over on the endgame bosses. In a narrative-heavy experience like God of War, I wasn't so much about the "yay, I beat them" approach, I just wanted to hear what the characters would say, how those arcs would wrap up. The challenge in combat wasn't as worthwhile to me as the narrative payoff I was seeking. The Last of Us Part 2 expanded their difficulty options from the standard easy to hard and allowed players to tweak the individual elements of the game to their liking. You could make the player characters more vulnerable to damage, make the enemies more or less difficult, adjust the stealth mechanics to be either easier or harder, create a land overflowing with resources or stripped bare. No matter where on the spectrum the player's wants fell, The Last of Us could accommodate them. Even a longer loop-based game like Hades doesn't have a suite of difficulty options, but it does have God Mode. God Mode, unlike most other games, doesn't make the prince and princess of the underworld invincible, but it makes them, at first, a bit harder to kill. And every time they are defeated, that power increases, making them just an ounce harder to kill. Even in a game designed with that loop, that grind, that drip of improvement in mind, the developers at Supergiant still found a way to retain the journey as designed while allowing a wider swath of players to, in time, enjoy everything they put into the game. And that brings us back to Rogue Legacy and Rogue Legacy 2. After feeling like I'd run into a wall for the umpteenth time there, not so buried in the settings, were house rules. Enemy health could be adjusted down to half or as much as doubled. Their damage output, 50 to 200%. Contact damage? You gotta hit me to hurt me, bud. That's the joy of house rules and of that sense of balance in games. It's not about making it easier, it's about making it yours. My Rogue Legacy experience was dropping bad guy damage output down so I could stand a long-term chance against them. Others might be put off by certain character traits and want to turn that off for a run or two. Rogue Legacy respects your time by allowing you to decide how you want to spend it. Sightseeing, fighting, or finding a different balance between where you're at and where you want to be. That's all well and good, but if there's one thing that I have always appreciated about games that I could never quite get with other media, it's how they do things their own way, in a way that books and movies and TV shows can't. When you're the one in control, games can truly wrap you up in the story. A lot of my game library represents this love. Walking simulators, visual novels, games where the mechanics take a back seat, but not all of them. Before there was Hades, there was Pyre. The short description is magic ritual basketball football with societal exiles, but spun in between those matches are conversations, dialogues, all building up the world and its characters. You get to know your teammates, their drives, their motivations, even what got them exiled in the first place. With victory in the rituals comes freedom, and you may be able to set any number of your teammates free. But the story won't stop you if you can't win against a tough opponent. Loss is built into Pyre's entire experience. The story will continue to be told, the end will continue to march towards you. Loss will flavor what the end looks like, along with the rest of your journey up to it, but it does not prevent you from experiencing the end. The Hades games are stories wearing the cloak of a roguelike. In the first entry, Zagreus, Prince of the Underworld, is destined to fall many, many times in his efforts to escape his home. But in defeat, he will always be brought back to the House of Hades, where many other denizens wander around or complete their own tasks. And with each re-entry from the River Styx, Zagreus has the chance to speak with those residents. Everyone from his father, the eponymous Hades, to his mother, Nyx, cousins and shades, mentors and friends will always have something to say or some new thread of the story to unravel. In my 100+ hours playing, I don't think I heard the same dialogue from a character twice. Hades 2, even in its early access state, is laying similarly engaging foundation for that cycle. That was what kept me going in Hades all 100 of those hours. The slow burn improvement of both tactics and mechanics, the challenge and triumph, were all that much more effective because of the story being told. My drive for success was equally classed with my excitement in defeat. Even in failure, I got to go back and talk to this colorful cast of characters, watch them build out the more I explored, becoming closer to them seemingly in real time. And through all those cumulative days of play, I didn't want to put down the story. Perhaps unexpectedly, I also want to touch on Elden Ring and the From Software library. In the structure of stories, you have peaks and valleys, those moments where the tension ratchets up and then slackens for a while before spiking up again. Those moments of tension are like the weather. You're walking in this big storm and then the storm passes. But the whole story is like climate. By the time you reach the end of the game, the storms have just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, dwarfing what you once thought to be the big one. Among other FromSoft stories, Elden Ring and its predecessors operate surprisingly similarly. Throughout play, there are those spiking moments on the narrative arc, from enemy placement you need to clear, bosses you must overcome, to entire regions that need to be traversed. By design, they are all feasible obstacles. Enemy spawn points are fixed, the bosses telegraph their attacks, the regions are static and flow into one another. Are they challenging games? Absolutely. But with each of their smaller, unchanging obstacles, you are the only thing that is changing. And once you overcome that hurdle, understand that enemy camp, know that boss, or connect that region, you can move on. You're not spinning in the same cycle over and over again with changing rules. You're getting better and better at individual sprints so that you can master the marathon. Lastly, I burned my way through God of War Ragnarök. On standard difficulty, it took me some 40-odd hours to have seen everything I wanted to. Complete the main story and the non-collectible based side quests. The equivalent of a hefty tome on a bookshelf, no doubt. And for as robust as the combat is, I knew I was coming into it for the story, and it kept me hooked on that story the entire time. Ragnarök respected my time as a player, all 40 hours of it, by making each part of the experience feel intentional. It didn't feel like anything was just filling the void. From conversations as we boated to a new shoreline, insight into the various side quests we were on, glimpses into the characters as we otherwise would have trudged in silence, it all feels integral to the story, pulling us that much deeper into the narrative beats, small and large. Even its roguelike DLC, Valhalla, subverts a roguelike's traditional setup to provide a satisfying conclusion to the story. You have your difficulty options, which helped me tweak the experience to be mine. An hour-long run didn't pad the story elements so far apart that they became trivial or made it feel like a slog to maintain that narrative momentum. In a game providing some sense of closure, even wrapped up in combat-based mechanics, that is what I wanted. To get closure and be able to close the story. The gameplay and challenge before and after the credits were for other players than myself. Even as long as Ragnarök and Valhalla's combined stories are, they justify their length by making it worth our time narratively. They respect our time by making every moment spent with it worth something. It's why we sit down to watch the full director's cuts of The Lord of the Rings, or why avid readers sit down with tomes thick enough that they could crush toddlers, or why we commit ourselves to these behemoth games. Because the shots they use, the words they choose, the stories they tell, are all worth it and respect our time, even when they're asking for a lot of it. So, what have we learned? Probably that roguelikes just aren't my jam. By design, they're not what I'm looking for in an interactive experience. But clearly, they can be yours. They wouldn't keep making them if they didn't appeal to someone. When I picked up Rogue Legacy 2, I wanted to play something familiar but not feel hung up on it. Feel like I was making progress without pouring hours into the experience. I wanted to see the areas, encounter the new bosses, see what was new and different from the original Rogue Legacy. And the house rules let me do all of that without feeling burnt out from the game. I appreciated that option. And I've been on all sides of the difficulty challenge argument. Learning and adapting to the set patterns in Dark Souls, grinding through the old Gears of War trilogy on the insane difficulty, cursing the Super Guide Pig and Question Block in Donkey Kong and Super Mario, and dropping the difficulty to the demeaning "Can I play Daddy?" in Wolfenstein 2's last level. I've gone into each game and each of those experiences looking for something different, and they've all been able to deliver by their design and their accessibility in challenge. None of those ways to play are better or worse than the other. Sometimes it's a lot of fun to adapt to the gameplay, pushing through the gauntlets set up against you. Sometimes fun means creating a unique challenge to overcome, or making the obstacles a bit more surmountable. Sometimes it's more fun for the gameplay to adapt to us. Sometimes we enjoy ourselves the most when we get to feel like we are making progress, and it feels even better when the ability to do so is baked into the game itself. Rogue Legacy 2 outshined its predecessor in every way I could think, most of all in its appeal to everyone. Hardcore sadists seeking a challenge can ramp up the difficulty. Progression-driven, momentum-invested players can knock it down a few pegs. It's a joy to see more and more games pick up on that philosophy. Everyone in between can find their own sweet spot. Everyone can spend however much time they want to on the game. Everyone can have fun by their definition, with whatever time they want or have to devote to it. Welcome to the after video. Now, you may be wondering, does he get the irony of talking about games respecting time while he has the audacity to ramble on for this long? Yes, he does, so don't bring it up. It'll bruise his already shattered ego. What other games have you played that you feel respect your time in some way? Or conversely, which games have absolutely burned you by how much they demand of you in exchange for not enough payoff? Let me know in the comments below. And please, I cannot stress this enough, don't go in there and call me a whiny baby gamer who probably plays everything on casual because I'm obsessed with stories and can't tell the A button from the B button and I'm just trying to fill the English major void in my heart that the literary canon never could. Don't do that. Thanks! Talk to you again soon.